the United Nations Environment Programme Science Division in Nairobi. I am also the UNEP Technical Secretary for the Joint Group of Experts on the Scientific Aspects of Marine Environmental Protection, GESAMP, an advisory group that advises the United Nations system on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us on this webinar. Welcome once again. And as you are aware, this webinar is going to discuss the topic Sargassum in the Caribbean and West Africa, key challenges, responses, and collaboration. Now, the purpose of this webinar series is to highlight key challenges, responses, and collaboration of Sargassum in the context of the Caribbean and West Africa, as well as highlighting efforts of the GESAMP Working Group on Sargassum. It will also build on the outcomes of the recent Sargassum International Conference held in Guadeloupe in October 2009. To start off, I will invite Habib El Habri, who is the coordinator of the Global Program of Action for the Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Activities, the GPA, in UNEP Ecosystems Division, to make some welcome remarks. Habib, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for introducing me and to have opened the this virtual webinar. I would like to join you in welcoming all the participants to this first virtual Sargassum meeting during these challenging COVID-19 times. As you know, it's very, very difficult these days to have face-to-face meeting. We would have loved to initiate this with a real face-to-face meeting, but here we are with a webinar. As you know, the GPA is a global program that focus on three main categories of pollution: the nutrients, the wastewater, and the marine litter. And the nutrients management is really covered with a global partnership on nutrient management, which is one of the three flagship partnership of the GPA, where excessive nutrients and coastal waters lead to Sargassum seaweed. The other two interrelated partnerships of the GPA are the Global Partnership on Marine Litter and the Global Wastewater Initiative. The issue of Sargassum is not really new, and back in 2016 at the United Nations Environment Assembly in its session 2, the Global Partnership on Nutrient Management and the GPA organized a side event with West Africa and the Caribbean government representatives entitled "The Climate Change and Our Changing Oceans: The Case of Sargassum Seaweed Invasion on West Africa and Caribbean Coasts," which was very, very well received. Also last year in 2019 was a landmark year for the GPA and the Global Partnership on hold on, I lost something is wrong. Okay. As I said, the 2019 was a landmark year of the GPNM and the GPA, with the adoption at UNEA for a resolution on sustainable nitrogen management. And this was followed by a launch of a UN global campaign on nitrogen management, which in October 2019 in Colombo, and the Colombo Declaration on Sustainable Nitrogen Management, which calls for an ambition to halve nitrogen waste by 2030 resulting in annual saving of around $100 billion globally. Furthermore, in 2019, a first international conference on Sargassum in Guadeloupe was organized by France, with emphasis on enhancing the dissemination of knowledge about Sargassum to the general public, identifying the actions implemented by the authorities of the countries and territories impacted and the best strategies to address this phenomenon, and strengthening cooperation in this area by defining a common political strategy which involves stakeholders at the regional and international levels. I've attended this conference, and I had the opportunity to discuss with the Prime Minister of France and other ministers present at that conference the issue of Sargassum and how to tackle this problem. I'm pleased to note that colleagues from both Cartagena Convention and the Abidjan Convention will further elaborate on their efforts to address the Sargassum seaweed invasions along their coastlines. This also will highlight our close partnership between the GPA and the Regional Seas Convention. Now I am pleased to welcome our new coordinator of the Marine and Freshwater branch here in Nairobi, Mrs. Leticia Carvalho, who will be very happy to share with us her concerns and her views on this issue. Leticia, you have the floor. You are muted. Leticia, you are muted.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you very much, Habib. I join my voice to yours and Joanna, welcoming you all to this webinar. I'm just seeing we are with more than 400 participants. This is amazing. So I just recently joined UNEP as the coordination of the UNEP Marine and Freshwater branch, within which the activities of the GPA and the GPNM are being implemented. I'm delighted to see the overwhelming interest in this important and emerging issue of Sargassum. We had close to 700 registrations for this webinar today. As I mentioned before, we are up to 400 colleagues online from all over the globe. I do recognize the partnership with the International Oceanographic Commission and UNESCO on Sargassum, especially through the GESAMP, with whom I had earlier interactions while with the Brazilian government. It is my pleasure to probably see some of my previous colleagues here today. I'm pleased to note representatives from Cartagena and Abidjan, as Habibi already mentioned, are here today, and we will have the opportunity to share their responses, their activities, and to really express what is going on in their regions as the most affected by Sargassum's invasions. So it is extremely important to have you here today sharing these experiences with us. So research shows that nutrients pollution in the marine and coastal environment fuels growth of Sargassum seaweed, which in turn negatively impacts the environment and human health, while not overlooking the importance of the economy through the tourism and fisheries industries. I hope that the discussions today are informative and stimulating, and we all learn more about the Sargassum in terms of the key challenges, responses, and the most important, collaboration, opportunities for collaboration among ourselves. The webinar today provides an excellent prelude to the upcoming World Environmental Day and the World Oceans Day, respectively 5th and 8th of June. Colleagues, UNEP looks forward to working with all of you and relevant stakeholders on this important issue of Sargassum, especially bearing in mind Goal 14 of the SDGs. And definitely not only the Go14, but also the UN Conference on Oceans, whenever it takes place, and the forthcoming UNEP 5 next February. Colleagues, I wish you an excellent webinar today, and you all to take this opportunity to learn and share your information. Habib, thank you very much for having me, and I turn back to you.
Thank you very much, Leticia. Thank you, Habib, for giving us that perspective of UNEP and how UNEP is together looking at this issue of Sargassum. Now, next, I will invite my colleague Henrik from IOC-UNESCO. Henrik is the head of the IOC Science and Communication Center on Harmful Algal Bloom, which is hosted by the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Henrik also is my counterpart as the IOC Technical Secretary for GESAMP. Henrik, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and also a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO. We are one among several organizations interested in, concerned about the Sargassum challenge, and since the massive accumulations of Sargassum occurred in 2011, of course, there has been a variety of responses at many levels, from local and regional and international, as well in the international research community. And therefore, also naturally, the member states of our commission have repeatedly asked for assistance to better understand and manage the phenomena. Our mandate is primarily to improve our knowledge base, our scientific understanding of the mechanisms behind these occurrences, what the drivers are. And we do that partly through our engagement in GESAMP, and also through jointly with the Scientific Committee on Ocean Research, which you will hear on a little later on the Global HAP program. In particular, we have, through our subcommission for the Caribbean, IOC-Caribe, and the Global Ocean Observing System component of IOC-Caribe, together with other regional players, in particular those under the Regional Seas Program of UN Environment, continue taking part in the efforts to develop operational region-wide information and forecasting systems for Sargassum, and also efforts that can develop guidance, best management practices for Sargassum events in the coastal environment. And this also includes, of course, the important role of the two conventions that are concerned by this in West Africa and the Caribbean, respectively. Also, through IOC-Caribe, we are engaging in the development of an all-Atlantic ocean observing system, which is coming out of the legacy of the Atlantis project. And we have already had a couple of colleagues referring to the recent conference that was held and hosted by France in Guadeloupe, which we also supported. And we also see this conference and that whole process as something that will help us prepare actions on Sargassum in the context of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, so we can get even more momentum in addressing the Sargassum issue. With this webinar, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk and welcome everybody, we also wish to see this as a way to express our interest and continued support to all initiatives we're contributing to improved understanding and management of Sargassum. And as Leticia very correctly pointed to, collaboration is one of the most important ways forward, and we think that is well reflected in the way this webinar is organized. So also, we are looking forward to continue with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrik, for those remarks. Next we will move to the session where we will be looking at Sargassum key issues and challenges. And I will next be inviting Peter Kershoff. Peter is the immediate past chair of the GESAMP, and because we have a very restricted time, you will find a little bit on him and his background available. Peter will be together with Brian Laponte, who is also an internationally renowned researcher on water quality and harmful algal blooms, be looking at this session on the key issues and the challenges. So I will first invite Peter to take the floor. Peter, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joanna. It's a great pleasure to be here. Virtually in any case. I'm an independent marine scientist. I'm based in the UK. I'm also a member of GESAMP, a body you've already heard about, an institution that's been in existence for 50 years now. And we started becoming interested in sargassum 3 or 4 years ago. And as has already been intimated, it's something we're carrying on looking at. But before we go into the problems of sargassum, I just wanted to remind you that sargassum in the right place is a wonderful thing. And the Sargasso Sea is known as the golden floating rainforest of the Atlantic. It's internationally recognized importance. It's seen as an essential habitat and a biodiversity hotspot. And even in the pre-2011 days, there were perceived benefits of accumulation of sargassum as it happened quite frequently on the shorelines of Bermuda. It was seen as a food source, especially for nearshore bottom-feeding fish, as a food source for intertidal invertebrates and shorebirds, as a nutrient source, stabilizing the shoreline by cementing sand grains, a source of fertilizer for farmers. And the only perceived problem that was seen by the authors of this quite seminal work on protection and management of the Sargasso Sea by Dan Foley and others was that a recognition that decomposing sargasso on the beach smelt, and in some people's view creates a nuisance. And that was as far as it went in terms of detriment. Of course, things change when there's an awful lot of it. And clearly with the impact of widespread and excessive accumulation of sargassum from 2011, a whole series of impacts were rapidly identified. We've heard already these mentioned, but socioeconomic impacts, so impacting fisheries. So shoreline and nearshore fisheries, it meant fishers couldn't access their fishing grounds. Even when they could, it posed a navigation hazard, and it often killed or limited access to the target species. It also clearly had a very important impact on the tourism industry. Tourists can move to a different resort on another island, but the tourism industry can't do that locally, and is very, very badly affected. And there's also been many instances of direct human health impacts where, because of this large quantity of decomposing seaweed and the release of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, there have been cases of thousands of people contracting respiratory illness and having to seek medical attention. And then, of course, there's the environmental impacts. So oxygen depletion, eutrophication, other types of biodiversity loss, particularly, for example, with nesting turtles, smothering sites, a barrier to the hatchlings. And even when attempts have been made to clear the sargasso off the beach, there can be a loss of sand, which in itself can lead to habitat damage and beach instability. Now, of course, it's a basin-wide issue. I've stolen these photographs from a presentation by Hazel Oxenford and James Franks. It's been widespread on both sides of the Atlantic. There are some potential benefits. potential utilization as a soil condition or a fertilizer, as an animal feed, and to extract energy. Although some of those uses may be limited because, for example, with fertilizer use, sargassum often has relatively high levels of arsenic, and that may cause a problem. So that's another area for future research. But whether we want to optimize the use or whether we want to mitigate the impacts, we need to have some predictability of the timing of these events, of where they're happening and the quantities involved. To utilize them in a semi-commercial sense, you need a reliability of supply, and you also need to come up with non-damaging or minimize the damage and have cost-effective mechanisms for interception and harvesting. Now, this is quite a complicated diagram. You'll hear more about the variability and causes in the next speaker, Brian Lapont, but I just wanted to point out a couple of main issues. We've heard that this phenomenon started in 2011, and clearly you can see from this upper plot, which is looking at the biomass by month, that there's a seasonal aspect, but there's also a very strong interannual aspect. So this phenomenon has occurred every year since 2011, apart from 2013, with a very, very large event in 2018. But the other thing is there's a strong geographical variability. I've taken these two figures from another recent paper, which is looking at average density at different times of the year, average between 2010 and 2018. And you can see the quite clear difference in concentration at different times of the year on different times of the Atlantic. So when you might get a maximum problem or issue in parts of the Caribbean at one time of the year, it may be later in the year that you see a similar type of problem in West Africa. Now, since GESAMP started first looking at this several years ago, there's been an enormous amount of interest and scientific inquiry and publications. And a number of factors have been put forward as potential contributing factors. You could think of them as being either variability in the physical parameters or variability in nutrient inputs. So changes in upwelling of West Africa and those currents involved, the eastern boundary currents, changes in position intensity of currents in the western central Atlantic, the outflow of the Amazon, so just the quantities of the outflow of the Amazon and the extent of the plume which extends from that. And again, recently, a group has put forward the hypothesis for a potential trigger. So why did it suddenly start to happen? And why did it suddenly start in 2011? And I can't go into all the detail of that, but there's the paper references given there. But essentially, a very major event in atmospheric pressure in the North Atlantic, which is defined as the North Atlantic Oscillation. In 2009, 2010, that winter led to a change in the direction and position of some major North Atlantic currents, which appears to have pushed sargassum over to East Africa, to Eastern Atlantic. And that may have initiated a regime change. In terms of variability in nutrient supply, perhaps the most significant may well turn out to be from major riverine nutrient inputs, especially the Amazon and the Congo. And in some cases, certainly for the Amazon, this can be linked to land use changes, such as deforestation and agricultural change. And I recommend a paper which our next speaker is co-author of in Science last year. Of course, there may be local inputs affecting this from wastewater and fertilizer use. And some have suggested that atmospheric inputs of nutrients, particularly dust from Sahara, may have an influence, although there is not very much data to support that's a significant factor. So where does GESAMP come in? Well, GESAMP's been around, I say, for 50 years, and it's intended to bring together independent scientists with a range of expertise, geographically wide-ranging, to provide authoritative, independent scientific advice for a whole series of organizations, but particularly for the 10 UN agencies who sponsor it. You can see their logos down at the bottom. I was involved in putting together a scoping paper back in April 2017 on the causes and impacts of these accumulations. What it presented was a limited review of knowledge, what was known the major items of research at that time, and it also identified the various individuals and research groups and organizations and initiatives which were relevant. Now that clearly is out of date, but that was our starting point. We then started, it was decided to start a new GESAMP task team, which was created in 2019. And the task team, one of its main purposes is to help organize an open science meeting on Sargassum with the IOC Global Hub, and you'll be hearing more about IOC Global Hub a little later on from Lisa Badele, sorry. Now, it was originally intention this would be happening in person later this year. Of course, with COVID, we're not quite sure when and how that's going to happen, but an initiative will happen. The task team will help to come up with an update of the situation, of the underlying science, and for GESAMP, it will bring together the interests of all the relevant GESAMP sponsoring agencies. So we have UN Environment, we've heard about already, IOC-UNESCO, but also, importantly, FAO, who are already active with a CC4 Fish project in the Caribbean and also have interest in West Africa. In addition to those three main agencies, UNDP have an interest from nutrient management in the Amazon, WMO have an interest in atmospheric inputs, and IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, have an interest in terms of the use of tracers to find out more about ecological processes. Now, the outputs of this open science meeting will be a discussion paper, a white paper. There may well be peer review publications and of course a meeting report. And another outcome will be to recommend to GESAMP on options for coordination and assessment, and where GESAMP may fit into the jigsaw of all these other activities and organizations and research groups that are trying to find out why this phenomenon is occurring and what we can do about it. The membership of that group is yet to be defined, but it will be based on principally on discipline and expertise, on geography and gender. And we will be looking for expressions of interest. And with that, those are my contact details if you want to know more about that, or you can go onto the GESAMP website. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening. And I'm very happy now to pass back to Joanna.
Thank you very much, Peter, for giving us a very good background and a picture of Sargassum, its impact, its benefits, and even the factors that cause this proliferation of this Sargassum weed. Thank you very much. Before I invite Brian to come on, I would like to encourage participants, because of the limited time that we have on this webinar, I will encourage you to post any questions that you have in the chat box, so we get a chance of looking at the questions before the time for questions come up. Next, I will invite Brian Laponte, who is a research professor in the Marine Ecosystems Health Program at Florida Atlantic University. Brian, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, and greetings from the Florida Keys, where I'm located. And I'd like to start by thanking my research coordinator, Rachel Bruton, who helped put this talk together today. My research with sargassum began back in the 1980s, around 1983. When I arrived in the Florida Keys on a postdoc, and we were growing sargassum as part of a biofuels project. And at that time, the sargassum presented quite a paradox to us. How can it flourish in nutrient-poor waters of the Sargasso Sea? As we just heard Peter describe, it's the namesake for the Sargasso Sea, but the issue to us was that these waters are very, very nutrient poor, particularly with respect to nitrogen and phosphorus. These are the two species, Sargassum fluitans and natans, that we've been working with since 1983. And that work began just off the Florida Keys near Lukey Reef in the lower Florida Keys, that red triangle, the southernmost Florida triangle in red. And we continued just collecting plants at that time and looking at their chemistry, and I'll be showing some of that. But then around 1985, the research expanded more broadly to go out to the Sargasso Sea. You can see what we term as the baseline oceanic stations that we collected and studied from in the Sargasso Sea. And then we also had baseline neritic stations, or more nearshore stations, such as those in the Gulf Stream off Cape Fear in Charleston, all the way down near Dry Tortugas in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as some of the red triangles, two of them down in Belize off the Belize Barrier Reef. And then after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, we received additional funding to expand the research further into the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea as well, and most recently made some collections in the Amazon plume. All these are the green squares, and you can see the two in the Amazon plume area from late last summer. Thanks to our colleagues at Woods Hole, there was a cruise of opportunity that we took advantage of. So beginning with the NSF work in 1985, we studied this shipboard collecting sargassum and measuring its photosynthetic rate, as well as respiration in what we call the jar fields, temperature controlled experimental apparatus that we used, as well as growth chambers where we could grow the plants, actually measure their doubling rates, and tissue analysis. And I'm going to be showing quite a bit of tissue data here, where we process the plants and analyze them for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus contents. The productivity studies, you can see the shipboard set up on the left. And here's an example, a summary of the results for Sargassum natans. You can see that the neritic stations, these more nearshore stations, had much higher productivity than the oceanic stations, okay? They're closer to shore, and as we hypothesized, these were taking advantage of nutrients in those nearshore waters. And indeed, that was the case. The tissue analysis showed that the carbon to nitrogen ratio was about 27 in these neritic areas compared to 47 in the oceanic stations. So that's a pretty significant difference. It explains that these populations are very nitrogen limited, particularly in the open ocean, not so much in the nearshore waters, but that value of 27 is still a nitrogen limited state. So more nitrogen coming off land, these plants are going to be more productive and grow more. We see the same thing with phosphorus, even more so. The neritic mean was about 270, that's carbon to phosphorus. compared to the oceanic mean of about 797. So we see that they're very strongly limited by phosphorus, even back in the 1980s. Well, since we did that work in the 1980s, I think we were all realizing that we have greatly altered the global nitrogen cycle. This graphic is from a paper by Stefan et al. 2015, just showing that we have now exceeded this zone of uncertainty for nitrogen on our planet, and that we're in a high risk situation. Of course, this is what's driving, to a large extent, the expansion of harmful algal blooms globally. From the Rockstrom paper, we see that we're adding as humans about 121 million tons per year of nitrogen, about 9 million tons per year of phosphorus. So the human altered N to P ratio is about 30:1, which is almost double that of the marine Redfield ratio in the oceans of about 16:1. So it's that nitrogen, more nitrogen than phosphorus coming into our oceans, that we believe is affecting sargassum in its broad distribution. So here we have an opportunity now with a unique data set comparing the chemistry from the 1980s with the collections since 2010. And we can see very clearly that the chemistry has changed quite profoundly. The percent carbon of sargassum has gone up significantly, as has the percent nitrogen, but the percent phosphorus has actually gone down. The C to N ratio has gone down. In this particular data set, it was not significant at the 0.5 level, but look at the dramatic increase in the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio from a value below the Redfield ratio of 16:1 in the 80s to a value approaching that value of about 30:1, as would be predicted by the human altered nitrogen cycle. And we can see the carbon to phosphorus also has gone up. So this essentially means these plants are becoming much more phosphorus limited than they were historically due to the elevated nitrogen. And it's interesting when you actually look at the data more closely, the highest nitrogen values occurred in the Gulf of Mexico off the Texas coast that's influenced by the Mississippi River plume, but also by urbanization along Texas, and the Amazon plume last August. And the highest nitrogen to phosphorus ratios, which seem to be a good tracer of nitrogen input in many areas, the highest of about 80:1 was right here in Florida Bay, and also in parts of the Gulf of Mexico as well. And we do know that the N to P ratio of many rivers globally has gone up, and that includes the Mississippi River. We also looked at just the time series between 1980s and post-2010 here at Lou Key, where we had the most samples over time, and we see almost the same results as we did with the entire data set, except that in this case, we did have a significant decrease in the carbon to nitrogen ratio that we did not see in the previous data set. It's very interesting now when we take all the data, the 1980s and post-2010 data, and break it down seasonally. We see no seasonal change in the percent carbon, but look at percent nitrogen and percent phosphorus. They have the most nutrients in the winter and spring, and those decrease in the summer and fall, indicating that as these blooms begin in the late winter, early spring, and into the summer, they become more nutrient limited by both nitrogen and phosphorus. And you can see the response in the C to N ratio going up, as well as the C to P ratio, indicating increasing nutrient limitation in the summer and fall. It's interesting that these river fluxes generally increase the Mississippi, the Amazon, through the spring months, peaking at about June. We also see that the N to P ratio is quite flat across the The seasons indicating that the supply ratio is staying the same, upwards of very close to 30-to-1. So we actually began to see increasing strandings of sargassum on the beaches in the Gulf of Mexico and the west coast of Florida, for example, back in the 1980s and 1990s. We saw, in fact, in August of 1991, an 80-mile-long weed line of sargassum come ashore on the west coast of Florida and clogged the intake pipe of a nuclear power plant, and it actually caused it to have to shut down. So we've been aware of increasing strandings actually prior to 2011, when the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt formed in the tropical Atlantic Ocean. And of course, we are all familiar with this. Both sides of the basin have been affected, Africa as well as the Caribbean. And we see that, with the exception of 2013, it's happened pretty much every year. You can see the seasonal development of the bloom in the spring, peaking in the summer months, and you can see the increase since 2014 in the aerial coverage of the bloom and biomass. And these are some of the satellite imagery from July from 2011, 2012, 2015, and 2018, just showing how the bloom has built, particularly since 2014, reaching its peak abundance in July of 2018, when it stretched 8,850 kilometers from the west coast of Africa across the tropical Atlantic, through the Caribbean, and up into the Gulf of Mexico, making this the largest harmful algal bloom on the planet. And if we look in that paper, the Wang et al. Paper in Science, we can see that there have been changes in the Amazon basin, deforestation since the year 2000. You can see how that's gone up in recent years by 25%, and a 67% increase in fertilizer usage and consumption in Brazil. We know climate change has caused an intensification of Amazon flooding, more water and more nitrate flux coming out of the Amazon River. The top left panel shows the nitrate flux at Obidos, where it's monitored. And you can see, in particular, in that record since 2014, how that increasing nitrate flux, those blue bars, have correlated pretty closely with the expansion of the bloom in the central West Atlantic region. So just to close up, the rivers are not the only source of nutrients that are feeding this Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. As we pointed out in the science paper, there are multiple sources of nutrients involved, and it's complicated. We need more sargassum research with the plants themselves in the tropical Atlantic Ocean, looking more closely at what we refer to as these buoyant river plumes that can carry nutrients out for hundreds and thousands of kilometers. Atmospheric deposition, and not just Saharan dust, but also from biomass burning in South Africa, which may be actually more effective at delivering soluble phosphorus to the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, because these plants potentially are much more phosphorus limited. That phosphorus input could be a key driver to those blooms in the tropical Atlantic Ocean. And of course, natural sources such as vertical mixing and upwelling can also potentially supply nutrients to these blooms. But as with other HABs globally, nutrient reductions on watersheds and airsheds could certainly help mitigate sargassum blooms as they develop locally and regionally, as well as other coastal harmful algal blooms. And with that, I'll just wrap up by thanking the agencies and organizations that have supported this research over the decades, and my colleagues as well, who have played a a key role in helping to advance the science of our knowledge base behind these sargassum plumes. Thank you very much.
Joanna, maybe you're mute, I think.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think I pressed the button. So I was just thanking Brian for that presentation where he has highlighted all the key issues associated with sargassum and the links that it has with the nutrients and also to the human altered nitrogen cycle, some of the challenges, and also telling us about the science behind and the better understanding that is required. So thank you, Brian. I would like to remind participants once again that they can put any questions that they have in the chat box. And at this stage, I will hand over to my co-facilitator, my colleague, Mahesh. Mahesh is with the Global Program of Action, the GPA here in Nairobi, and he is in charge of the Global Partnership for Nutrient Management. Mahesh, I hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, co-facilitator Joanna. And now we move on to the second part, which is looking at regional reflections on the sargassum issue. We heard about the science and the research. And now we have our colleagues from the Caribbean and from Africa, from the Cartagena Convention and the Abidjan Convention, to tell us more about some of the responses and ongoing efforts in this regard. So the first presentation is a joint one between Ileana, who is based in the Kingston office, the Cartagena Convention, and who is responsible for the SPAW, which is the Specially Protected Areas and Wildlife Subprogram of the UNEP Regional Seas. So Ileana, who will be joined by Sandrine, who is the director of also the Regional Activities Center, RAC, the SPAW RAC, who is from France and is based in Guadeloupe. So without further ado, Ileana, I pass it on to you first.
Good morning, colleagues and audience. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, please? Can you confirm?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's for me a pleasure to be with you this day. In name of the Cartagena Convention Secretariat, it's with great gratefulness to be part of this webinar, and we appreciate organizers, panelists, and audience. As mentioned before, we are going to share briefly, because we don't have enough time, what is going on in the region. And I appreciate also my colleague Sandrine Pivar, Dr. Pivar, to be with us, sharing part of the work done at the Especially Protected Areas Regional Activity Center in Guadeloupe. So this is basically a summary, an overview of the snapshot that is going to be presented today. And without more entertainment, basically we are going to see some facts and numbers that are affecting part of this equation that has been presented before about how this influx of nitrogen and phosphorus and as well impacting sargassum is reflecting in the economic situation of the region. Before to start, this is kind of advertising, I will say. We are part of the United Nations Environment Program, and as you are aware, in 1974, the UNEP launched the regional seas programs. We are part of the regional seas programs, and in 1981, UNEP established the Caribbean Environment Program. So without more entertainment, in 1986, the Caribbean Regional Coordinating Unit was established in Kingston. This is where we are, and we have 3 protocols. I apologize for not having here included the protocol concerning pollution from land-based sources, but we work closely in high collaboration. And as part of the COP decisions, we need to be working because this is an issue that is highly interdependent. In 2018, for example, in the region, there was an estimated amount of US dollars, 120 million for Sargassum in the Caribbean. So basically, as you can see, there is a high interdependency between the outflow of the Amazon and the Amazon plum and what we have here. During the first semester the same year in Mexico, witnessed a large decline in tourism as a consequence of this amount of Sargassum. There are several online platforms where countries and tourists, they share the amount of Sargassum, so they go or cancel to the different tourist destinations. In 2018, it was another record-breaking year because, as mentioned before in the charts that we saw this morning, the total amount of seaweed reached approximately 6,000 kilometers, which is 20 million tons in the month of June. And if you compare this, it's like 4 times the times of the island of Guadeloupe. And this will make necessary 30,000 of the world's biggest trucks to complete this process of removing. In several hotels, for example, in Dominican Republic, you can witness that they are trying to provide awareness to countries in the region, to visitors in the region, so they can see that what is the seaweed, and to say that apologies for disturbing the tourists. People don't appreciate to have a beach where they have Sargassum. So in 2019, the cost of keeping one beach resort clean was around 150,000. Mexico, for example, has spent 17 million in 2019, and from May to August 2019, 609 tons of Sargassum were collected, affecting 13,000 people. Here some are some of the methodologies that are being used to clean the sand, and you can see that they go from very sophisticated machines that collect at the ocean, but there are some others that also take place at the area of in the sand, and this highly affects, as it was mentioned before, the sand, the species, the biodiversity. There are some other very simple methodologies that are being used, for example, in Honduras. This one to the left, that were some of the machines presented at the Sargassum Conference and Expo, and to the right is in Dominican Republic. Sorry, going to go to the next slide. So these are some of the barriers to stop Sargassum that are being used for the group of Punta Cana and other consortium, but you can see that this still poses some challenges because there has not been some environmental impact assessments in terms of the materials, how they are built, and also how they affect the species. Because as you can see at the next slide, this is the new design that they came out with, and they say that it doesn't affect the species, but we need to see, I mean, if this is like a cast net. And in a few words, we have witnessed here a cascade of events in 2019, just to make it short. For example, in the May 2018, there was a workshop organized by UNESCO in Montserrat in July 2018. It was the 5th meeting of the organization Eastern Caribbean States, the Council of Ministers, and they called for an action. In Mexico, June 2019, again in Quintana Roo, took place an international meeting for Sargassum. Then Guadeloupe has been mentioned several times. And in Jamaica, there was another event in November 2019. So there is, as I mentioned before by the experts at the beginning and some of our colleagues, there is an urgent call for international collaboration and coordination. And that's why we foresee the importance of calling for a draft resolution on Sargassum challenges, as has been expressed by several contracting parties. For example, the government of France is really pushing into have this a very important issue, as well as Mexico and others. So this falls well in line with the decade from United Nations Decade of Ocean Science, as has been expressed. And I would like to give now the word to Dr. Sandrine Pivar, so she will take us to explain what actions have been taken by the SPO protocol in coordination with SPO-RAC according to the STAC, the Scientific and Technical Committee decisions last year in Honduras, as well as the COP10. And there is also a big call for collaboration and work with the LBS protocol. Sandrine, please.
Sandrine, please unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Ileana, go on with the slides. I've got only three ones. Keep. Ileana? Okay, thank you. Can you just show the following one, please? Yes, the following one, please. So let's go to the next one because we have only 3 minutes remaining. Thank you. So thank you very much. As Ileana said, I'm going just to focus on a few. Now the previous one on a few actions we are doing. Ileana, can I have my first? Yeah, no. Oh.
Sandrine, it might help if you say the title of the slide.
Yes, it's just the previous one, a few actions from SPO. Thank you. So as Ileana said, we are focusing first on collaborating and on the relevant and regional global initiative. Today is a great example, and I really thank the organizers for that. Ileana gave some of the national example we contributed to, for instance, the French and Mexican initiative last year. We also had some work with our colleague Jacques Hab. And of course, we need to mention Chris Corbin for the LBS protocol. How important task also is to networking of stakeholders involved in communication awareness, research and management of the influx. And for that, I will show you the forum we developed for that. We also contribute to funding and broadcasting communication tools. We don't have a large budget for that, but you've got an example where we helped GCFI to do a great poster about the management of Sargassum influx. And as it was said, we insist also on the fact that Sargassum is not only a problem, it's also a very ecological, important ecosystem. And of course, we have an issue of fundraising. We're focusing on fundraising to be able to develop actions. We have a dedicated teamwork platform with more than three participants and 200 participation. You're very welcome, any of you, to join that platform. You've got information, you can ask for them. Please do. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And last but not least, from the contracting parties of the Cartagena Convention are very focused, of course, on that question. So we have requests to work on that issue from the work plan of the SPO protocol, and also during the last assembly, during the STAC 8 and the COP10, we were clearly asked to focus on specific actions as cooperate with the relevant partners to assess and merge information and best practice, and also to coordinate, to liaise with the different organizations that are focused also on that. And we were requested to create ad hoc working group that was created last year. The nomination are very, we have strict rules for the nomination. The nomination must come from the contracting parties of the Cartagena Convention or from observers of the SPO protocol. For the moment, we have 12 members. We're expecting a bit more of them, but we can also have associate experts. So feel free, if you feel that you are interested in the last slide I will show, to give us information so we can do the best work at the regional level. And for instance, for the next step of that working group, we have the fact to review already the production done as the white paper on Sargassum, some concept notes, things like that. We also have to review external reports, for instance, from the International Atomic Energy Agency. We need to find synergy with the Caribbean Sargassum program, the SARCOP Interreg Progress, in which France is deeply involved. We have to focus on sub-regional assessment and recommendations if the impact is very different in terms of frequency and intensity from a territory to another within the Caribbean Sea. And very importantly, we need to explore funding opportunities for the contracting parties. And as I said, we are expecting a bit more experts to the group, and feel free to make any suggestion or to associate to us if you feel you can do it and you wish to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ileana and Sandrine. In the interest of time, maybe let's move on to the West African region, where we have Prof. Jack Abe with us, who is the coordinator of the CCLME, which is the Canary Current Large Marine Ecosystem program under the Abidjan Convention. Jack, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm now opening my slides. Thank you. Let's say thank you to the UN Environment Program, and also to my Executive Secretary for giving me the opportunity to share and talk about the Sargassum in the West Africa, the key challenges, responses, and collaboration. Let's say that, first of all, this abundance of Sargassum in West Africa started really in 2011 in the whole West African coast, the Abidjan Convention area. And this has drawn increasing concern from national and regional entities in the region. Like Brian Lapointe said, this story started in Florida from 1983. So compared to 2011, we are really now thinking how to tackle this issue. And now we learned that it was the factors provoking this Sargassum most of the time the nutrient input in the sea from the Amazon River or Congo River. And here the area covered by the Sargassum in the year 2011, and where we can find them periodically in the West African states. So mainly we have two species, the Sargassum natans and fluitans. That's the two species mainly occurring in our coast. And the period of occurrence is mainly April and up to July. And I will show you the countries on the left in this column showing from Senegal to Nigeria. And like I said, by 2011, started appearing of the sargassum in our beaches up to now. And like you can see, they appear in May, and from there, let's say April, May, and disappear by June, July. What are the ecological impacts in West Africa? Sometimes when the sargassum are on the beach, it's difficult for tiny turtle hatchling to get to the ocean. And also, we have noticed some fish kills. In Senegal, it was mentioned significant quantities of dead oysters. And the young Isophora also are impacted by the sargassum. Also in Senegal, sometimes where the sargassum are, you can find dead birds. The ecological impact are not only negative, and you can see that sargassum also are helping to stabilize some beaches, trapping the sands. And secondly, when coming from the open sea to the beach, they are serving as habitat for a number of species, like turtles and so on. The socio-economic impact have some. You know that mainly the small fisheries, small-scale fisheries are happening along the coast, near the beach. And when the sargassum are there, the fish catch is reduced. And of course, the income of the fishermen. And the propellers for the canoes and net are entangled. Impeded movement of canoe resulting in longer travel time. And you have also a longer time for net mending and also to catch for the weeds because of the weeds. So, of course, at the end, you have low revenue in the value chain. And also, as economic impact, you have reduced beach aesthetic when the sargassum is in a certain quantity on the beach. And sometimes you can smell undesirable odors. And also, when they are in the sea, itching skin after swimming in infested water, and a reduced number of tourist traveler patronized facilities on the beach. What actions so far are taken in the West African state? Let's say at local management action, several countries in West Africa have adopted seaweed cleanup policies to periodically remove invasive seaweed from the beach. But sometimes funding remains the main challenge. And we have also at the district assembly and municipalities, some environmental agencies are responsible of managing and protecting local environment in the region. They are dealing with the sargassum, cleaning them. So these bodies mobilize communities to clean the beach, but it's not easy. And we just got a publication from our friend Roland Ofori from Ghana with Mark Rouleau, who did a nice work on how to put incentives to the population for them to take care of their beach. And the local management also are trying to bury the sargassum when they come, clean them and bury them sometime, and also putting them together as a fertilizer and also to feed the livestock, and also as the composition of the sargassum. As you can see, some analyses were done in West African countries showing the composition, the concentration in dried matter, which can be used in pharmacy. So local action alone, of course, may not address or solve the problem. We have seek regional collaboration to address the Sargassum invasion, and is under the coordination of the GPA, the Abidjan Convention for the UN Environment, and the USAID through WADIC program since 1915. Try to prepare a regional strategy and action plan on the management of the Sargassum seaweed. And to do so, the first meeting on marine, gathering marine biologists and oceanographers was organized in Sierra Leone in November 2015, and followed by a second one organized in March 2016. And the first, after the first in Sierra Leone, the second one was held in Monrovia, Liberia, to went beyond the management of Sargassum to initiate a comprehensive strategic framework for the management of the other invasive species, plants and animals in general, beside the Sargassums. The ultimate goal of this initiative is to validate the management strategy and include recommendations on the formulation of an additional protocol to the Abidjan Convention. In August, the second expert meeting, like I said, was organized in Monrovia and contained of the West African regional strategy. Is responding through 10 points. Let's say, first of all, early detection of rapid response is needed. Secondly, to control emerging aquatic species population using regionally effective methods. Also, the research part is not neglected, as we need to understand really the behavior, the biology, and the ecology of the Sargassum in the region. And also, the fourth point is to tackle the legislation and the control and management. The countries have to try to put in place some legislation to manage this Sargassum in the region. We need collaboration. In terms of collaboration, countries should collaborate, institutions should collaborate between them in the region, and also from the region to the other region, like in the Caribbean. Education and awareness are also needed. Funding arrangement, of course, at the local level, some local funds can be searched for the population to clean the beach when the Sargassum is there, but also we need also funding from bilateral collaboration with other institutions. And you have the value addition, alternative use, and the prevention. Of course, prevent is better than cure, like we used to say. So let's prevent trying to collect this Sargassum by the sea before they get to the beach, creating all the nuisance that I've talked about earlier. And of course, pollution control, like Sandrine said right now, all this is included in the LBSA protocol prepared by the Abidjan Convention to follow and try to manage all kinds of pollution, including the Sargassum in the region. What's the way forward? Of course, we know that the Sargassum influx is a kind of nuisance. It's a pollution for the West African countries. But Sargassum also brings with its number of important benefits that must be fully appreciated and accounted for our response. Investment in beach which in cleanup technologies and management system are needed. Because sometimes when you are equipped to collect using small boats like the one we just see in the Caribbean by the sea, it's better to collect it because before they get to the beach. An investment in new opportunities like in the industries, using them as a fertilizer, using it in the pharmacy and so on. And a regional adaptive strategy would require greater understanding of the seasonal landing of sea, including their growth dynamic and their economic potential use. And we have seen them with Brian Lapointe in Florida, where it has been shown all the possibilities of analysis that can be done to understand the biology and the ecology of this sargassum. This issue will be discussed at the COP13 of the Abidjan Convention to be held in March 2021 in Pointe-Noire in the Republic of Congo. And a decision will be taken for action within the 22 countries of the Abidjan Convention. With this colorful image, I will thank you for listening all along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. We now move on to our last speaker, but I see that a lot of questions are coming through, so I encourage the panelists to please look at the chat box to see the questions and the ones that they want to answer. So the last presentation now focuses on research and a research update on our harmful algal blooms. We have Elisa Verdalet from the Institute of Marine Sciences in Barcelona, Spain. And I think she's also the current chair of this global harmful algae blooms steering committee. Elisa, yours the floor now.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to me to be sharing my computer with so many people in the world. So thank you for organizing this meeting, this webinar, and then inviting us. Just to check, is my screen seen well?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Can you hear me well? Yes, too? Yes?
I can hear you well.
Okay, thank you. Then the presentation is a research update on harmful algal blooms, and then the example that we are having here today, the sargassum, is the typical example of what is a harmful algal bloom, which is something, it's a term that the humans perceive as harmful somehow. And the last presentation by Jacques Abe, he pointed out at this. It's our perception, but it's a natural event and with plenty of benefits. And this is the perspective of the Global Hub, which is an international program for coordination of the research on this kind of events, natural events that may have a human component in fostering it. So this is the program that I have the pleasure of chairing the scientific steering committee. This was the program supported by IOC of UNESCO and SCORE, and it was launched in 2016. It's expected to be lasting until 2025. And which is the goal of this program? Is to improve understanding and prediction of HABs in aquatic ecosystems. It means freshwater, estuarine, and marine environments, and to improve the management and mitigation of their impacts, as we are trying to do here in the case of the sargassum, which is the mission of Global Hub: foster international coordination and cooperative research to address the scientific and societal challenges of HABs, including the environmental, human health, and economic impacts in a rapidly changing world, as we all know. Global Hub also aims to serve as liaison between the scientific community, stakeholders and policymakers, informing science-based decision-making, an objective of the talk today too. This is, you can see here, the cover page of the Global Hub Science and Implementation Plan that you can download it here in this link here. You can download it free, and then you will find a web page like this one, where it is clearly seen this wish that Global Hub also helps to implement the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Here below, you can see the link to the Science and Implementation Plan, and also point out here the importance of getting involved. What it means is that Global Hub is a program to serve the international community and also to engage the international community, as today is the case of the Sargassum. Hubs are not an easy problem or an easy event to address. We have seen today the importance of understanding the role of nutrients, but also physical oceanography. We saw models, we saw satellite images, we saw biogeographic questions, the species, biodiversity, etc. In the web, I saw that there are many groups today following this, like people also in NOAA, just to say another example. So, in the case of the Global Hub, the Sargassum is an example where we need to understand all those different aspects: biodiversity, adaptive strategies, the link with physics, nutrients, etc., but also this link between health, economy, culture as well. We need observations, and then with all together we can get models and predictions to help in this, to contribute in this management advice. So the Sargassum is integrating all those aspects and perfectly links with Global Hub. Then, as I said, we need to serve the community, to identify problems or events or questions or topics, and Sargassum was one of them. And then what we thought in Global Hub is, why don't we start facilitating that the international community meets with these different perspectives? And the Open Science Meeting is one of the tools. In the past, in Global Hub and GeoHub had very nice experience developing what it can be called like a science plan, an implementation plan for particular topics. It was the case, for instance, in the upwelling systems, Hubs upwelling system, or the case of the benthic systems with the Ciguatera, for instance. So Sargassum now is the topic. Let's address it through an open science meeting, and we contacted several people with biogeographical distribution, also gender balance, and different expertise. We can see here the pictures of different people that now we are working together to try to organize an open science meeting where everybody is welcome from now. This open science meeting is jointly organized with GESAMP. We saw today Peter Kershaw here, and the EuroC, which is an European funded project coordinated by Caroline Cusack. The Open Science Meeting will help us to identify the research priorities. We saw many of the questions today by Peter, for instance, Brian, Ileana, and Sandrine, Jax, Letizia, etc. And then we have to identify these research questions, try to understand the growth dynamics of Sargassums, to develop adequate forecasting and warning systems, and to allow long-term preventive measures for Sargassum bleaching. As Jax was just mentioning now, we need to prevent. What could be the content of this open science meeting? Well, to elaborate the state of the art, the Sargassums. Note that we have here included Asia, and in the map that we saw just in the previous presentation, we saw red dots in Asia. This is why we also want to incorporate this area there in the meeting. We want to assess the impacts in ecology and economy. We want to identify solutions. Some of them were already listed before, and design monitoring strategies. In the Open Science meeting, we could have presentations, diverse presentation, diverse topics, and very important, we could have discussion groups where people can interact, and then together we can try to see solutions for the prevention and to understand what is going on. I think we have a very changing planet, and these ratios that Brian was showing us maybe just an indicator of what is changing in the world, and Sargassum is just one more let's say protagonist of the changes. And then from this Open Science meeting, we could have a report, a white paper, and to establish a subcommittee to define what it needs to be in the future for science and about Sargassum. And very important, try to coordinate this research that is going on in the world as we have seen today. And well, if the COVID-19 pandemic allows us, it would be great to have the meeting in Sargassum. The Universidad Autónoma Nacional de Mexico has well, is very happy to be the local host. Brigitta van Dussenberg is the local organizer there, so it could be held in Cancun in November 2020, and you can contact Henrik Nevolsen or me, or just to go back here, I didn't mention the names of the organizing committee, which is Brigitta, Brian here in the talk today, Esther Serrao from University of Algarve in Portugal, José Martinelli Filho from the University of Pará in Brazil, Hoang Tin from University of Sciences in Vietnam, and myself and Henrik. And I think is all that I had to tell you today. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to be in touch with all of you.
Great, thank you very much, Elisa. As expected, I think in terms of time, we've not done very well. There's so much to say on this important topic. So what we will do now is move, because we've seen so many questions that have come in. So in terms of each of the panelists who have been looking at these questions can give a brief response to some of the questions that they feel are directed to them. Not all the questions. So we will start with Brian, since he had most of the questions, and then move across all the panelists very briefly before we wrap up the session. Brian, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe you can turn on your video too, would be good.
There we go, okay. Great, well, thank you for all the questions, some really great questions. One on sea surface temperatures and warming. You know, Sargassum is a tropical plant, these two species, and so the bloom, the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, is in the tropics. So we think generally it's not seeing a lot of temperature stress, certainly not on the low end, possibly on the high end, perhaps. These weed lines can get very thick, 10 kilograms of wet weight per square meter or more. You can have a lot of solar heating in them, where they could actually suffer some respiratory effects that could actually decrease their productivity, but we don't seem to be seeing that. Warmer temperatures in fringe areas of the North Atlantic Basin could increase their growth. When temperatures get below 18 to 20 degrees, for example, their growth and photosynthesis does go down. However, with increasing sea surface temperatures, we do get more evaporation. That means more rainfall. That means greater discharges from the rivers. So that would be a big effect of increasing sea surface temperatures. Also, it could be related to a shallowing of the mixed layer in the ocean. It could, for example, provide a greater opportunity for vertical mixing of nutrients coming up from the depths, higher nitrate and phosphate. And there is some evidence that that could be playing a role too, kind of a natural nutrient source coming up into the surface waters. Another question, mesocosms versus laboratory bioassays. We've done a lot of research over the years trying to grow sargassum in land-based cultures, ponds and tanks, and in the laboratory, and it does not grow that well in captivity. You can grow it for days, perhaps weeks, but it slowly becomes very stressed in culture. So we really prefer mesocosms in situ. We use cages to measure its growth rate. We dose it with nutrients. In fact, here in the Florida Keys, the biggest nutrient effect we've seen here is dosing it with phosphorus because of the high nitrogen available in the water and the high nitrogen to phosphorus ratios. We have seen a tremendous response to phosphorus, and that's why I'm particularly concerned about phosphorus inputs in the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt that could be most stimulatory to biomass production. The N to P ratio, there was a question, is this in the water or in the sargassum? The data I showed on the slides, it was the sargassum tissue itself, and that really is the best way to address the nutrition of the plants. And that's what I would recommend to monitor the tissue of sargassum in different geographic regions and seasons. And we are looking not just at nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon, we're starting to look at micronutrients like iron, for example. We do have evidence that some of these micronutrients can become limiting, particularly iron in culture here in the Florida Keys. So that's something we're going to be looking at in the future. And another question about what about carbon in effluents? For example, dissolved organic carbon, we know there's a lot of that coming out of rivers, and that can affect microbiomes. And certainly that could be important to metabolism within the sargassum community itself. And we did see a slight increase in the carbon content of sargassum. So that's something that potentially could be related, and it would be something certainly good to look at in terms of the cycling of nutrients by microbes within the sargassum community itself. And I think that's it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brian. Peter, anything you picked up from the questions?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. A couple of questions mentioned the UN Decade of Ocean Science and its relevance here. And in a way, the sargassum problem is absolutely made for the decade, or the decade is made to answer the sargassum problem. And the UN Decade is organized around a whole series of societal challenges: clean ocean, safe ocean, predicted ocean, and so forth. I was fortunate enough to go to a planning meeting for the North Atlantic regional preparatory meeting in Halifax earlier this year, and several of us, or many of us, raised the sargassum issue as something which was crying out as a major challenge, which the decade should be addressing. And although we were dealing just with the North Atlantic, we said, well, it has to be a whole Atlantic issue. It has to be the South Atlantic, it has to be the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. So how that comes out in the science program, maybe Hendrik can say a little bit more about that. But I think absolutely that this is an example of where the UN Decade can be utilized to really make some important progress. There was another question about what can we learn from other challenges. One mentioned was the green macroalgae crisis in Brittany and France. If any anyone's aware of that. Most famously, a man riding a horse, the horse collapsed under him and died whilst riding through a mat of green algae on the beach. One of the issues, one of the differences, I think, is in the case of France, it's a single nation state. They have some control over the management of nutrient use on farmland and so forth. And there's a prospect of doing something more directly. I think the issue is something like Sargassum is you have multiple potential influencing factors, some of which are more or less beyond your capacity to manage, like ocean circulation, and others may be far removed from the region in which the problem, so that the problem, part of the cause may be elsewhere, for example, in Brazil or in the Mississippi somewhere, but the problem is expressed somewhere else. So it becomes a much more complex issue, and I think it's not just a science problem then when you want to solve it, it also relates to how society organizes, its political, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's where, but I think what you can do is you can learn from some of the research which has gone into those individual problems, like in Brittany, there are significant health impacts, for example. So we can learn from things like that. One last one, someone said, okay, we have a GESAMP task team, a SPA teamwork platform, SARGNet, lots and lots of networks. But if we're not careful, we spend all our time trying to work out what's going on and communicating and so forth, and we don't have that much time. I think it's absolutely right, and I think what we have to be very clear about is what all these different, what's the aim of all these different initiatives, separate out what different groups can do, make sure we're talking together. We use things like the Open Science Meeting to talk about the science. GESAMP is, which I sort of have a background in, is a good way of bringing together certain UN agencies and regional bodies, but all these different, but you need local-based organizations in West Africa and the Caribbean and so forth. So I think don't try and duplicate, but try and complement, and that's much easier said than done. But thanks for the question. Thank you.
Great, excellent, Peter. Let's move on to the regions. From the Caribbean, Ileana, Sandrine, anything that you would like to add or respond in terms of questions?
Thank you, Mahesh. I just shortly wish to share that we already have a white paper that we are more than happy to share with the GESAMP colleagues. Of course, it needs to be revised, but also so we don't start from scratch. So please count with this white paper that we have been preparing over the years. Number two is in terms of the SARGNet and the teamwork platform, we need to really enhance coordination, and we need to become perhaps one or just to delimitate actions. And for the next questions that were raised at the platform, please, I wish to ask my colleague Sandrine, so if she can provide the answers. Even she did it already by the chat, but probably she wants to explain more. Thank you, Mahesh.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ileana. Just so for the few questions that were addressed to Samuel, yes, of course, we try to consider the impact of managing sargassum on the beach, and especially the impact on species. And if you have a look on the poster done by GCFI, you will see that a lot of the good practice you need to do, or the thing you must not to do on the beaches, is explained on that. It's something I can share again. It's already shared on the teamwork platform. I can share it again, as well as I will share the white paper Ileana said. It was already done, but so it allows you to refresh it on the platform. I agree with the fact that we have several platforms and that it would be great but well, Peter already answered to that, Ileana also. The teamwork platform was a request, something created in 2015 to answer to the contracting parties. It's something we need to keep in a way. And as for the last one, the most questions were regarding the working group. So it's a kind of closed working group because it has strong rules. from the contracting parties, but in a way it's also possible to associate some of you, so don't hesitate to contact us. Mahesh, I don't know if I'm allowed to give my address, or contact us through the Teamwork platform, and we will answer to that. Or I give my address.
Yeah, we can share that. Great. Okay. Let's move on to West Africa. Jack, any response from you?
Yes, one of the listeners was asking whether all the countries have their own response plans to fill into the regional plan. I would say that the regional strategic plan prepared by the Abidjan Convention is the framework, and this will help the countries really to finalize something, because you know that pollution is transitory, have transitory aspect, and what was prepared will help the countries really to finalize what they can do in their countries. And the second one is that the map showing the Sargassum spreading in the region, in the Abidjan Convention region, look like Mauritania and Morocco were not there. They are really members of the Abidjan Conventions. And what happens sometimes is that when we send mails to the countries to tell us whether the Sargassum is there or not, sometimes when we don't have answer from there, we cannot take on us to mention something when we have not seen it. That's why the IT drew the map like this, but we have not forgotten Mauritania and Morocco at all.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jack. Last but not least, Elisa, from a science perspective, any of the questions you would like to respond?
Well, I saw here, I think a key point is that this need of coordination. I think there is a lot of knowledge in the web, let's say. This white paper, excuse me, just mentioned, I think we are really not starting from scratch. So I think it's timely to join efforts and try to find those solutions. It's plenty of information and teams in the world that have been investing years of research, and just this, we need to try to find the best way of coordinate and joint efforts from all the parts of the world, as it has been noted here. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I think that was a nice sort of feedback from all our panelists. Before we wrap up, and I recognize we've indulged in terms of extra time, we still have nearly 400 participants online, so we would like to sort of wrap up now. Joanna, any thoughts from your side?
Thank you very much, Mahesh. On wrapping up, I think that this, like I said at the beginning, is the beginning of a series of discussions. So hopefully we might have the opportunity to delve into the different areas and pick from there. We've been looking at the key challenges, the responses, and collaboration. And it's very clear that the challenges across the two regions concerned, they are almost the same. The issues that were put down are the same. And the science that was also shared will work across better in the two regions. So the emphasis here will be for us to work together, a collective action across board. No country or no particular region should be working in isolation. And I think that's the way the presentations went. We see that there's a lot that is being done in the different regions. How can we bring all of this together so that when action is taken, it will be a collective thing? I mean, I see here, sorry to use this analogy, but it's like a COVID-19 situation. You can't work it out on your own, because we are talking about the ocean currents are moving it here and there. And so we have to work at it together. And I think from the the convention's perspective, you can see that they are working together on both sides, and they have made some efforts at coming together at one point or the other. GESAMP also has a very nice mechanism where UN agencies come together, all of them having some form of mandate on the ocean. So my way forward is we should continue this discussion, because we have what it takes to actually sort out this problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. And just to add to Joanna, in terms of, I guess, the challenges, the responses, and the way forward, under challenges, I think research is essential. That was mentioned. And this is perhaps something that as a group we can all focus on, and the need for not just even satellite monitoring, etc. So we have the Open Science meeting coming up, and I think this gives us a good sort of segue in terms of what Lisa mentioned with this the research on the harmful algae blooms. In terms of responses, and here especially I think from the two regions, it's really interesting to see what SPA is doing, and the white paper that Ileana mentioned, and the different collaborative platforms that Sandrine also shared. There is this very active Sargassum network listserv that we also need to look at. And I think there, the response that has been done is quite commendable. In terms of West Africa, and here it was quite interesting to see the West Africa regional strategy, the framework that Jack talked about. That gives us some scope, especially in terms of preparation for COP13 of the Abidjan Convention next year. Again, this issue is coming up in both the regions, both sides of the Atlantic, and I think if we can come together, will give us much more strength. And again, collaboration, coordination was mentioned. With collaboration, and I saw in Ileana's slide where she talked about a possible resolution at the next UN Environment Assembly, UNEP 5, which is not too far away, February 2021. But again, a lot of the groundwork and countries and policymakers will need to come together to sort of focus on this issue. UNEP 5 is one. We have the Open Science Open Science meeting coming up, hopefully in Mexico. That's another. We have the whole UN Decade of Ocean Science coming up as well. That gives us a lot of scope in terms of collaboration. But I just wanted to say that for our first conversation, this webinar on Sargassum, it's been really rich, and I would really like to thank all the panelists, both from the opening remarks, from Habib, from Letitia and Henrik, providing the context, and then moving on to some of the key issues and challenges from Brian and Peter, and then the regional reflections we had from both sides of the Atlantic, Caribbean, with Ileana and Sandrine, and then also with Jack from Abidjan. And finally, Elisa also telling us a bit more on the science on the harmful algae blooms and the open science meeting that's scheduled. So with that, colleagues, the 363 colleagues that are online, thank you very much for staying with us for the entire duration. It's amazing what we can do sitting in one room across many different continents and communicate and share our passion for this key issue of Sargassum. So from UNEP, once again, thank you very much and goodbye.
Okay.
Bye, Mahesh. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.